You are watching KOCT's North County Roundtable. On today's show, we have Elizabeth Warren, candidate of the 76th District Assembly.
Welcome to KOCT's North County Roundtable. I'm Alison St John, and we're going to be speaking with one of the candidates who's running for the 76th California Assembly District, which runs from Camp Pendleton down the coast to Encinitas. This is a district which has traditionally been Republican, but the voter registration is changing, and two Democrats made it through the primary. Tonight, we have with us Elizabeth Warren, California's Elizabeth Warren. Thank you so much for joining us, Elizabeth.
Thank you, Alison. I'm happy to be here.
And we should mention that the other candidate, who is Tasha Boerner Horvath, has not been able to join us due to a scheduling conflict. So, Elizabeth, why don't you start by telling us why are you running for the 76th Assembly District? This is a California State Assembly seat.
Honestly, because I think it's time for regular people to get involved in the process. I have a background in journalism and went from that to community organizing. After my husband and I lost our home in the mortgage crisis, I was determined to find out what happened. I did a lot of research, and then I became involved with an organization called Move On. I started organizing at the local level and then statewide and eventually nationally, and then worked for a couple of other nonprofits and found that I actually loved policy and ended up, fast forward to 2016, I was at the Democratic National Convention, as a representative for California, and came back with my fellow delegates. We talked about it, and they said, you really ought to think about running. You have some good ideas on policy, and you have a good head on your shoulders, my friends said. So, they're my friends, but the point was we decided that it was a good idea for a regular person to run, and I had some support in the community.
So maybe people will be wondering whether you have much in common with the other Elizabeth Warren, the one that everybody's very familiar with. How would you say you compare to her in terms of your values?
Well, I'd say we have a lot of the same values. I actually met her a number of years ago, shortly after she was elected. She came out to California, so that was sort of fun, getting a photo together. We don't agree on every single policy, but I would say in terms of trying to represent working people, look out for communities, level the playing field, make sure that everybody has a fair shake. I think I share those values with her.
Now, you're running against another Democrat. Do you see that as being perhaps more challenging than if you were running against a Republican in November?
Actually, no, because we don't necessarily follow the exact same positions on the issues. I think that, we're different enough where the voters can take a look and decide for themselves if they, agree with our policy positions.
So perhaps you could give me an example of maybe 2 or 3 issues that you have that you feel would distinguish you from your opponent.
Well, probably the most prominent one, and the one that's gotten a little bit of attention because it's kind of controversial for me as a Democrat, which is that I oppose the gas tax.
Right.
And not for the same reasons that other people do, but frankly, I think it's time we stop dumping on working people and small businesses who have no choice but to commute or to run vehicles, in order to make a living. There's a lot of other places we could get that money, and it does seem to me that a lot of times when we need money for something, we oftentimes go to the people who can't fight back, who don't have a lobbying group up there in Sacramento fighting for them. It's easy to just levy a tax and say, okay, deal with it. And honestly, I don't think it's environmentally smart either. We're locking our necessary infrastructure funding to the sale and use of fossil fuels for the next several years. I think we can come up with a better mechanism for getting those funds.
Well, let me just follow up on that because
okay.
Everybody knows how terrible traffic is on 5. And the fact that we do need to be spending more money on our infrastructure in order to be able to keep moving. What other alternatives would there be to fund those improvements?
Well, for example, one of the things that I differ from my opponent on actually too is I'd like to close that Prop 13 corporate loophole. And when I say close the loophole, I'm talking not about small businesses. I'm not talking about, small investors who might own one rental property. I'm talking about, folks like Disneyland. I actually said that when people said, hey, you've won the primary, what are you going to do next? I said, I'm going to go to Disneyland and demand they pay their fair share in property taxes because they've been paying basically, you know, on what their property was valued back in the 70s with very little increases. People are very
protective of their Prop 13 protections.
Well, yes, and I believe that I absolutely do not want to touch those for homeowners or even small investors. Again, a lot of folks, retirees, you know, when housing became, you know, affordable, of course, we had that, you know, mortgage meltdown and a lot of homes were for sale. And I know people who bought them as like their nest egg for retirement. I don't want to hit those folks at all. I think it's important that individuals, small investors, they get protected. But the very, very, you know, multi-billion dollar corporations, they're not paying their fair share. And it's time they just started paying their fair share so that the rest of us don't have to bear the burden of carrying them.
There's another issue that's very close to many people's heart, which is health care. And the California State Senate has voted for a health care for all bill, which would cost, I believe, $400 billion. Where do you stand on health care for all at the California level?
I support it. I think that we've got to do some tweaks to make sure that we have the funding mechanisms in place. It's been sort of complex, and I know it's been divisive. I've looked at some of the newer bills that they're introducing to sort of replace it, and I think they're kind of going backwards, you know, talking about cost containment for providers and for testing facilities, but not holding insurance companies to that same standard. You know, the only way we're going to provide affordable health care is we take the profit motive out of it. You know, and I feel that way about most community services. I think, you know, when we're talking about public services, necessary things like education, healthcare, you know, police and fire services, you name it, we need to deliver those services at cost. And I think that's fiscally responsible. There's plenty of places for for-profit businesses, but when it's something that you need, you know, things that would normally have been covered under a civic umbrella, those things should not be for profit. We can't afford it.
Now, bearing in mind that this is a district which has always been Republican, Rocky Chavez was a moderate Republican, but now we have two Democrats. So how are you going to appeal to the Republicans in this district? Almost 50% of them are registered Republicans.
Well, I've actually been having a lot of conversations with Republicans. I support small business, so I think we need to do everything we can to help our small businesses survive. I actually did a walk in Vista that they do every year where they talk to the small businesses and they ask them, okay, how have you been affected by some of our building and construction that's been happening? Tell us what you did. And they're, you know, reaching out, and some of them are doing better because they have an online presence. Others were struggling because they were requiring, you know, walk-up traffic. And so understanding what small businesses need, I've been taking a lot of time. I've met with chambers of commerce. I've met with people from all different kinds of businesses. And I really want to help them. I think it's important that we go local. I mean, one of the things that I did back in 2013 to 2016 was fighting a global trade deal. And I think that in order to strengthen our communities and sort of hunker down and protect ourselves from the overarching threats of globalization and that happen, the bad things that come from it, not the good things, we need to take a long, hard look at our small businesses, and we need to strengthen them and do everything we can to keep them functioning and prospering.
And specifically in Sacramento, what might you be able to do?
Well, for example, we need to offer incentives, and we need to do something to level the playing field when they're having to compete with, say, out-of-state commerce, where you're talking about a state, for example, like Florida. I was talking to the farmers this morning, and they're saying, all right, in Florida they have a minimum wage that's half ours, and their cost of living is lower, and their materials and everything, and now they're bringing stuff here, and we can't compete. What can we do? So I think we need to do some things to make it easier for our businesses to do business here, and to protect them from, you know, I want to say unfair competition from other states that don't have as high a cost of living as we do. Housing is a huge cost, and a lot of the farmers were telling me, for example, that, you know, they need housing for their workers. You know, workforce housing is a component of this too. People being able to work and live in the same communities if they choose.
I think everybody who's a voter is worried about affordable housing. So what could you do in Sacramento to increase perhaps the affordability of housing?
Well, again, I think this comes down to having a conversation with communities, with developers, with the folks that are actually going to be putting these programs together, and saying, all right, what can we do to help cover these costs. I think it's important that we not simply say, okay, we're going to build affordable housing. Well, what is affordable? Are we going to use a HUD formula that's sort of artificial, or are we going to talk about what it actually costs to live in a community? And, you know, for example, they used to offer housing for, say, police and firefighters in California. There were these kinds of programs. And I think we ought to take a look at doing that again, and maybe getting creative about how we fund it. Taking a look at saying, all right, this is an infrastructure issue. So maybe we take something from our state infrastructure budget. You know, we have lots of big projects that we have that are half finished in California. And maybe we take a look and say, all right, let's triage this. You know, we need to talk about what do we need right now and what are we looking at in terms of putting investments into things that are going to be very useful in the future, but maybe we're kind of ignoring the forest for the trees.
Well, there's quite a lot going on in Sacramento right now to try
Yes.
to increase affordable housing, but you think that there might be more strategies that you could introduce or that you could support beyond what's happening already?
Well, I think, you know, what Sacramento does is they issue mandates. And they, you know, up until recently, they were saying, well, you have to have a housing plan, but they're not saying that you actually have to build the housing, or not until recently. And so a lot of cities like Encinitas, for example, they're having a tough time agreeing on how their housing element ought to look. And it doesn't look like maybe they're going to get approved for what they've recently submitted, and they can't make up their own mind. And then
But there's no enforcement.
Right, and there's no enforcement. And then we have, you know, people criticize the NIMBY attitude, but I think it's important that we get folks to the table, you know, and for every issue. And I don't mean to be overly generalizing, but what I've discovered, and I'm saying, talking to businesses, talking to law enforcement, talking to teachers, talking to nurses, talking to farmers, the common refrain that I hear is that nobody is listening to each other. We have this polarizing kind of climate where everybody digs their heels in and says, this is what we must do. And nobody's willing to sit down and say, all right, we're not all going to get everything we want, but we have to stop demonizing somebody that doesn't agree with us and figure out a compromise so that we can all work together to make our communities better.
Well, this is very relevant in a district which is almost neck and neck Republican and Democrat. So can you give us an example of an issue where you might in fact be supporting, you've mentioned the gas tax, but where you might in fact be supporting something that Republicans care about rather than supporting the Democrats?
Well, again, the gas tax I know is something that Republican voters, I think, tend to like. But actually, when I was door knocking, I found that as many, like, I want to say rank and file voters across the board. I mean, the politicians that are Democrats may like the gas tax, but the average person does not.
Right. What about Marines? I mean, we've got Camp Pendleton as part of your district here.
We have Camp Pendleton, and yes, we have a unique community in that we've got active duty military families, and we also have a lot of veterans. And we have issues, and this is something that I'm sort of stumped right now. I will have to tell you, what are we going to do about providing behavioral health services that are going to take the place of what, you know, we've lost with Tri-City or will be losing? You know, because a lot of our military families, you know, yes, they have services that they can access, but oftentimes they will reach out and need community services. And it's not an easy fix. Believe me, I know that. But it sort of comes down to, and nobody likes to talk about taxes, but when you talk about the largest corporations in California are not paying their share and haven't for a long time. And I think we need to take a long, hard look at what lobbyists are managing to negotiate up in Sacramento with campaign contributions. And I know this probably doesn't sound popular, but we've got privatization of our prisons. We've got the private prison lobby. We've got big pharma. We've got big insurance. We've got folks who are actually telling Sacramento, this is what you're going to do. We have a cap and trade bill that was virtually written by the fossil fuel lobby. And everybody says this is the best we can do. But we don't really do what we should be doing because we're answering to the wrong people. And I think when you're a legislator, you can't serve two masters.
Well, this relates to perhaps the fact that your fundraising has not been very strong, and your opponent, Tasha Boerner Horvath, has raised many times what you have managed to raise. Normally that would indicate she's the stronger candidate, but maybe you don't see it that way.
Well, I look at it this way. If you're willing to take money from anybody, you can get a lot of money. But I'm very selective. There are people that I announced on day one, I will not take money from these folks. And I sort of boxed myself out, but I didn't do it unintentionally. when I get to Sacramento, I won't owe anything to anyone except for the voters in the 76th district. And this is something that, you know, I could share an anecdote with you, which was sort of fun.
When I have a few seconds left.
Okay.
So let me just ask you finally, the people who endorsed you, again, your opponent has locked up a lot of very powerful endorsements.
Yes,
Many
she
of the
has.
significant politicians and leaders in the community have endorsed her, but tell us who you feel are the most significant people endorsing you.
Well, I think every person who has endorsed me is significant, and I think maybe that's the difference between my opponent and me. Because when you say powerful people have endorsed her, that's an interesting choice of words. Because power is one of those things that I don't think it should come into play when we're talking about public servants. I think that the people who have power are the people who cast their ballots on November 6th, and those are the people that I respect. And yes, I can rattle off a list of, you know, progressive organizations and community groups and folks that have endorsed me, and it would take an awful lot of time. So I would say visit my website and look at endorsements, because that way I won't waste your time, but I have many, many endorsements. They're long, and they're not the power players, the people that you would look at, but I honestly think the reason I'm running is to kind of shift that balance of power.
Represent those people.
Yeah, shift the balance of power to the regular folks, because frankly, when I started organizing, it was the 99% movement time.
We've come to the end of our time, speaking of time.
Well,
but you've made your point
you.
that you want to represent the people, and I'd like to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Alison, and I would love to visit with you again and talk more.
California's Elizabeth Warren, who is running for the 76th Assembly District.